the last 10 years, you've seen kind of a cultural Marxism in media. How does that different than economic socialism that you identify with?
I can't tell you how much I appreciate this question because it just, it's so rare that somebody reads me so carefully and really gets at the beating heart of the thing. The cultural Marxism that we're seeing is really an attempt to take, I guess, something that was in Marx, the idea that there is a power differential between the boss class and the laboring class, and that to labor is to be exploited, right? That idea is in Marx, and I don't agree with that at all. What happened, in our culture today is that they took that idea of a fundamental, incontrovertible power differential between the powerful and the powerless. For Marx, it was at the economic level. Today, we see that at the gender level and at the racial level, right? So you see this idea that is actually very academic in nature, right? The idea that there is a dividing line between the powerful and the powerless when it comes to race, between white people and people of color, when it comes to gender, between cis hetero males and everybody else, trans people, women, etc., and that power differential is the most important thing. So we have replaced a worldview on the left that used to be built around right versus wrong. And instead, the only thing that matters is who has the power and who doesn't. So powerful versus powerless, and then superimposing race and gender onto that. And I think that is a fundamentally godless way to look at the world. And it is the opposite of what my hero, Dr. King wanted, which was a world in which we were all being judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, by the things we can change about ourselves, our virtues, the way we act, the way we treat other people. That's how you're supposed to judge people, right? We believe that we were, created perfectly in the divine image, and that our job on this, in this world is to make sure that our laws reflect that, perfection, that equality. But their worldview, the new, what you've called cultural Marxism, is a view that takes this idea of a fundamental power imbalance and says that's the most important thing. Now, to me, that's, like I said, is fundamentally at odds with what every person that I respect, every book and worldview that I respect, believes and should believe in. But I think Marx was right that there is, in America today, at least, a Marxist analysis gets at what the real problem is, which is the economic divide, the class divide in America, the fact that our country is being run and written about in journalism by people who are overeducated with degrees from fancy schools that teach them to have contempt for the 2/3 of Americans that don't have a college degree. And the fortunes of those in that top 10% with those fancy degrees are on the rise. So these affluent liberals, they're actually getting very wealthy while preaching their own virtue on the one side, and the fortunes of the working class are in a downward spiral to where people are literally committing deaths of despair because they don't see a future for themselves in this country. And so that divide, that economic class divide, I think the Marxian analysis is very relevant here. And that's what I wish people would talk about, is that class divide. And of course, it relates to partisanship, political polarization, not because it's about politics, it's about class, but because the working class, irrespective of who they vote for, tends to be more conservative. So Black working class people, Black middle class people tend to be much more religious and much more conservative than the elites that represents them, even though they tend to vote for Democrats as well. Working class Americans are much more conservative because the reason for that is, in order to have these kooky views that are now being mainstream, these cultural Marxist views, you have to go to one of these fancy schools because they're so crazy. You never come up with them on their own, right? Like the idea that there's no difference between men and women, right? No working class person is going to come up with that because it's so counterintuitive, right?
I'm sure that you can already tell why I was looking forward to talking with Batya. So you mentioned a couple times in there something about faith, your faith, or being made in the image of God. How has your faith impacted? What faith do you ascribe to, and how has it impacted your view on these things?
I'm so glad you asked that. I'm a person of faith. I'm Jewish, and I was raised very, very religious, Orthodox, and then I left. I became, super liberal, lefty. I became a big feminist, and but then I came back, and I'm again observant, and I feel that religion is so important, and that a society that doesn't have religion, it loses the ability to base its society on right versus wrong, because they can't tell, how do you, without a tradition to root yourself in, when it's just your intelligence, your logic, your brain, there's nothing to stop you from following that down the road of, critical race theory and other academic malarkey, I like to call it, to where you no longer have a society that's fundamentally rooted in right versus wrong and in protecting the vulnerable, which is, I think, what we have today. So I increasingly think that religion is deeply important to a society and deeply important to America. But it's impossible not to see the sneering and smearing of the faithful from the highest echelons of power on the left, which is, I'm still on the left, but I frequently encounter that. And it's one of the reasons I wrote this book. My book is about contempt. I mean, it's about the contempt that the people who think they are the moral ones have for people who have less than them. And I just couldn't, sit idly by and watch that anymore.
Now, you went to one of these fancy schools that you talk about, right? I mean, you have a PhD from University of California at Berkeley. And should I assume that was part of your liberal stage or lefty stage that you referred to earlier?
Yeah, people always say to me, what's your PhD? And I'll say my PhD is in nonsense, because, the secret about getting a PhD is, so I was working on 18th century texts. And I have this also from my Jewish heritage, because what you have is, our holy books, it starts with the Old Testament, but they're sort of still being written. There's like that long Talmudic tradition. And so every generation, people who are smarter than us, like brilliant, brilliant people, sat down and read the same primary text as us, and came up with brilliant things about it. And so the idea that you're going to come up with something that's true that hasn't already been said is just, you have to be so arrogant to think that, right? That you have to, so that humility, right, is sort of integral to Jewish text study, is like, if you come up with something, you always start by that. I'm sure somebody has said this before, but when you're getting a PhD, so I was studying 18th century texts, which meant that, for the last 300 years, people who are much smarter than me have been reading those same texts, those same books. So everything that's like true about them has just already been said, right? But you can't say that and get a PhD. You have to come up with something new. And so there's a premium placed on things that are like counterintuitive, that are not true, because that like that guy in the 19th century who was writing about the 18th century, he's the guy who got it right. It's like obvious, he was like, he cracked the code of this book, but you have to say something anyway in order to have a job. So you have to make something up. And that's really that thing, that mode of thinking, the counterintuitive, the like, you would have thought that this is the true thing, but let me tell you, it's actually the thing you least suspected. That's where I think a lot of our racial and gender conversation is coming from, the counterintuitive. And it's essentially a way of making sure that religious people and working class people and people who don't go to fancy schools don't get to have a say anymore, because you penalize their views. You say that their views are no longer acceptable.